The bitter taste of acrid smoke filled the small cabin as Ethan Ramsey threw open the door, waving frantically at the black clouds billowing from his cast iron stove. It was the third time this week he'd burned breakfast beyond recognition, and it wasn't even Wednesday. The year was 1875, and while Ethan could track a steer for miles across the New Mexico territory without losing its trail, he couldn't seem to master the simple task of cooking beans without turning them into charcoal. "Damnation," he muttered, tossing the ruined pan onto the porch of his modest homestead just outside Las Cruces. The New Mexico sun was barely cresting the Oregon mountains to the east, casting long shadows across his struggling ranch. At 32, Ethan had managed to build a respectable spread, small compared to some, but it was his. What he hadn't managed was figuring out how to keep himself fed now that his longtime cook had moved on to the big cattle operation up north. Ethan ran his fingers through his sandy brown hair, still damp with sweat from his early morning chores. His stomach growled in protest at missing yet another meal. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed mending, and here he was, hungry as a wolf in winter with nothing but scorched food to show for his efforts. He glanced at the biscuits he'd attempted earlier, hard as rocks and black as coal. Even the coffee had a bitter, burnt taste that made him wince with every sip. His ranch hands, Miguel and Josiah, had taken to bringing their own food rather than risk what Ethan called cooking. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention away from his culinary disaster. A wagon approached, kicking up dust along the narrow road that led to his property. Ethan squinted against the morning sun, recognizing the silhouette of Thomas Wilson, the town's general store owner. "Mornin', Ethan," Thomas called out as he pulled his wagon to a halt. "Smelled your cooking from half a mile away. Thought I'd better check if the whole place was on fire." Ethan grimaced. "Very funny, Thomas. What brings you out this way?" Thomas climbed down from his seat, his round face cheerful beneath his bowler hat. "Got someone here who might interest you." He turned to help his passenger down from the wagon. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as a young woman stepped down, her simple blue dress catching the morning light. She wore a practical bonnet that couldn't quite contain her auburn hair, and her green eyes surveyed the ranch with intelligent curiosity. "This here's my niece, Tabitha Winters," Thomas said proudly. "Just arrived from Boston yesterday. My sister thought some time out west might do her good after." He trailed off, exchanging a glance with the young woman. "After my fiancé decided banking was more important than marriage," Tabitha finished, her voice steady despite the flicker of hurt in her eyes. "Uncle Thomas has been kind enough to offer me a place to stay, but I'm eager to find work of my own." Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "Tabitha here is a wonder in the kitchen. Cooked the finest meal I've had in years last night. And when I mentioned my friend Ethan, who's been burning every meal since old Pete left." He gestured at the smoking pan on the porch. Ethan felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "I manage just fine," he said stiffly, though his stomach chose that moment to growl audibly. A smile tugged at the corner of Tabitha's mouth. "I see." She glanced at the charred remains in the pan, then back at Ethan's face. "And how long have you been managing just fine, Mr. Ramsey?" "It's been about a month," Miguel called out helpfully as he led a horse to the corral. "We're all skin and bones, miss. The man can't even boil water without burning it somehow." Ethan shot him a glare, but Miguel just grinned and tipped his hat to Tabitha before continuing with his work. Thomas looked at Ethan expectantly. "Well, Tabitha needs employment, and from the looks of it, you need someone who can cook without setting the territory ablaze. Seems like a fine arrangement to me." Ethan hesitated. He hadn't considered hiring a woman to replace Pete. The ranch was no place for a city woman. The work was hard, the days long, and there was precious little comfort to be found. Tabitha seemed to read his thoughts. I assure you, Mr. Ramsay, I'm not some delicate flower who will wilt at the first sign of hard work. I've been cooking and keeping house since I was 12 years old. It's not that, Ethan said awkwardly. It's just that. It's just that he's too proud to admit he needs help, Thomas interjected with a knowing smile. Stubborn as the day is long, this one. Tabitha's eyes met Ethan's, and something in her direct gaze made him straighten his shoulders. I can pay fair wages, he found himself saying, but the accommodations are simple. There's the cook's quarters off the kitchen. It's small, but it's private. I'm sure it will be more than adequate, Tabitha said, nodding decisively. When shall I start? Before Ethan could answer, his stomach growled again, loud enough for all to hear. Tabitha's lips quirked in amusement. Perhaps today, she suggested. It sounds rather urgent. Despite himself, Ethan chuckled. Today it is, then. Thomas, would you be kind enough to bring Miss Winters's belongings by later? As Thomas agreed, Tabitha was already rolling up her sleeves and marching toward the cabin. She paused at the porch, eyeing the ruined breakfast with an expression that mixed horror and determination. Mr. Ramsay, she called over her shoulder, do you have eggs? And perhaps flour that hasn't been scorched? Yes to both, Ethan replied, following her. Though I make no promises about the state of either. Tabitha nodded and swept into the kitchen with the confidence of a general entering battle. She took one look at the chaos, the burnt pots, the scattered ingredients, the residue of Ethan's failed attempts crusting on every surface, and turned to him with an arched eyebrow. I see the problem now, she said dryly. And what might that be, Miss Winters? Ethan asked, crossing his arms defensively. Tabitha gestured at the mess. You're trying to conquer cooking like it's an enemy to be subdued. Food needs patience and care, Mr. Ramsay, not brute force. Without waiting for a response, she rolled up her sleeves further, located a clean apron hanging forgotten on a peg, and began clearing the workspace with efficient movements. Ethan watched, torn between embarrassment at his own ineptitude and fascination with her methodical approach. Within minutes, she had a clean surface, fresh ingredients laid out, and a new fire burning at just the right temperature in the stove. She cracked eggs into a bowl and began whisking them with practiced ease. Is there anything I can do to help? Ethan offered, feeling suddenly useless in his own kitchen. Tabitha glanced up, a hint of surprise crossing her features. Yes, actually. Could you slice some of that bacon? Not too thick, mind you. Relieved to have a task, Ethan took up a knife and began carefully cutting the bacon. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the sizzle of food cooking properly and the occasional direction from Tabitha. As she stirred a pot of what smelled like heaven itself, Ethan caught himself staring at the way sunlight from the kitchen window caught in her hair, turning the auburn strands to copper. She must have felt his gaze because she looked up suddenly, catching him in the act. Is something wrong, Mr. Ramsay? Ethan quickly shook his head. No, not at all. It's been a while since this kitchen has seen such competent hands. A pleased flush colored Tabitha's cheeks. Thank you. She hesitated, then added, though I'm curious how a capable man such as yourself has managed to burn every meal for an entire month. Surely you must have learned something in that time. Ethan laughed ruefully. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But no, each day brings a new culinary disaster. Different methods, same charred results. Tabitha's expression softened. Well, perhaps with some instruction. She trailed off as the pot began to bubble more vigorously. She reached for the spoon, but Ethan was already there, their hands brushing briefly. The contact, though momentary, sent an unexpected warmth up his arm. Here, she said, recovering first. Let me show you. She gently took the spoon from his hand. Move over, I'll stir the pot. And just like that, with those simple words, Ethan felt something shift in the atmosphere of the kitchen, as if the house itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. He stepped aside, watching as Tabitha transformed his disastrous attempts at breakfast into a meal that soon had his ranch hands gathering eagerly around the table. As they ate, Ethan caught Thomas's knowing gaze and answered it with a noncommittal shrug. Yes, he needed a cook. Yes, Tabitha was clearly excellent at her job, but that was all. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. Yet even as he told himself this, Ethan couldn't help noticing how Tabitha's laugh brightened the worn kitchen, or how the sunlight seemed to follow her movements. It had been a long, lonely month of burnt meals and solitary evenings. Perhaps what his ranch needed wasn't just a cook, but the particular warmth that Tabitha Winters brought with her from the east. Tabitha settled into life at the Ramsey Ranch with surprising ease. By the end of her first week, she had transformed the cook's quarters from a sparse, utilitarian space into a cozy retreat, complete with a small vase of wildflowers on the bedside table. The kitchen, once a battlefield of culinary disasters, now ran with efficient precision under her guidance. Ethan found himself inventing reasons to linger in the kitchen, watching as she worked her magic with the simplest ingredients. There was something mesmerizing about her hands, capable and sure as they kneaded dough or chopped vegetables. When she cooked, her face took on an expression of peaceful concentration that fascinated him. "You're hovering again, Mr. Ramsey," Tabitha remarked one afternoon as she prepared stew for the evening meal. She didn't look up from the onions she was dicing, but there was a smile in her voice. "Just making sure you have everything you need," Ethan replied, leaning against the doorframe. "And I've told you it's Ethan. Mr. Ramsey makes me feel like my father." Tabitha glanced up, knife pausing mid-chop. "Very well, Ethan." His name sounded different in her voice, softer somehow. "And yes, I have everything I need, though I wouldn't say no to some fresh herbs if you happen to ride into town tomorrow." Ethan nodded, making a mental note. Any particular kind. Rosemary would be nice, and perhaps some thyme. She resumed her chopping, adding, "I thought I might plant a small herb garden behind the kitchen. Would that be acceptable?" "Of course," Ethan said quickly. "Whatever makes your work easier." Tabitha smiled, the expression lighting her green eyes. "It's not just about making work easier. Fresh herbs make food taste better, and from what I've gathered, this ranch could use some enhancements." There was a teasing note in her voice that made Ethan grin despite himself. Over the past week, his ranch hands had taken great pleasure in regaling Tabitha with tales of his cooking failures. The time he'd managed to turn beans into something resembling stone, the infamous incident with the biscuits that Miguel had threatened to use as horseshoes. "I wasn't that bad," Ethan protested half-heartedly. Tabitha raised an eyebrow. "Miguel told me you once started a small fire trying to boil water." Ethan felt heat rise to his face. The handle of the wooden spoon caught fire. It could have happened to anyone. "Of course," Tabitha agreed solemnly, though her eyes danced with mirth. "Just as anyone might have mistaken salt for sugar when making coffee." Ethan groaned. "They told you about that too?" Tabitha laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "They've told me everything, I'm afraid. Your reputation as the worst cook in the New Mexico territory is firmly established." "Then I suppose I should be grateful you arrived when you did," Ethan said, his voice suddenly serious. "We all are." Something in his tone made Tabitha's smile fade slightly. She looked down at her hands, a hint of vulnerability crossing her features. "It's good to be needed," she said quietly. Ethan wanted to ask about her life in Boston, about the fiancé who had been fool enough to let her go, but he held his tongue. Whatever had brought Tabitha Winters to Las Cruces was her business. If she wanted to share it, she would do so in her own time. Instead, he straightened and said, "Well, I should get back to work. Those fence posts won't mend themselves." Tabitha nodded, already turning her attention back to the stew. "Dinner will be ready at 6, she called after him. As Ethan stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, He found himself looking forward to 6 o'clock with an eagerness that had nothing to do with hunger. The days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning, Ethan would wake before dawn to tend to the early chores, returning to the house to find coffee brewing and breakfast nearly ready. Tabitha was always awake before him, no matter how early he rose, her hair neatly pinned back, her sleeves already rolled up for the day's work. One morning in her second week, Ethan entered the kitchen to find her frowning at a pot on the stove, her lower lip caught between her teeth in concentration. "Something wrong?" he asked, reaching for the coffee pot. "I'm trying something new," she explained, stirring the contents carefully. "A porridge with cinnamon and dried apples, but it's not thickening properly." Ethan peered into the pot. "Looks fine to me." Tabitha gave him a look that was half amusement, half exasperation. "No offense, Ethan, but given your culinary history, that's not particularly reassuring." He chuckled, conceding the point with a nod. "Fair enough, but I do know that whatever you make will be delicious, even if it's not exactly what you intended." The genuine compliment brought a pleased flush to Tabitha's cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly. Then, with a determined set to her shoulders, she reached for more oats. "But I still want to get it right." Ethan watched as she adjusted the recipe, adding a pinch of this and a dash of that with intuitive confidence. "How did you learn to cook like this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You mentioned you started young, but this is beyond simple home cooking." Tabitha's hand stilled momentarily. "My mother died when I was 12, she said, her voice matter of fact. "Father was devastated. He's a professor at Harvard, brilliant with books but hopeless with practical matters. Someone had to keep the household running, so I taught myself." She resumed stirring, adding, "I found I had a knack for it, and I enjoyed creating something that brought comfort to others." "I'm sorry about your mother," Ethan said quietly. Tabitha gave a small smile. "It was a long time ago. And in some ways, taking on those responsibilities helped me through the grief. It gave me purpose when everything else felt senseless." Ethan nodded, understanding more than he could express. He'd lost both his parents by the time he was 20, his mother to influenza, his father to a heart attack 3 years later. The ranch had been his anchor in the storm of loss, giving him something solid to hold onto when the world seemed determined to sweep away everything he loved. "The ranch was like that for me," he found himself saying. "After my parents passed, it was the only thing that kept me going some days. The work, the rhythm of the seasons, the knowledge that what I did mattered." Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding, a recognition of similar wounds carried with dignity. Then Miguel burst through the door, his usual exuberance shattering the quiet intimacy of the moment. "Miss Tabitha, is that coffee I smell, and what's cooking? Smells like heaven itself." He pulled off his hat, grinning broadly. Tabitha turned away, composing herself. "Porridge with cinnamon and dried apples," she replied, her voice light. "And yes, there's coffee. Help yourself." As Miguel poured himself a cup, chattering about the day's work ahead, Ethan stepped back, watching Tabitha resume her cooking with practiced efficiency. He felt as if he'd been granted a glimpse behind a carefully maintained curtain, seeing a depth of character that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. Tabitha, for her part, seemed determined to maintain her professional demeanor, though Ethan caught her glancing his way once or twice, a thoughtful expression in her eyes. Later that day, as Ethan worked on mending a broken wagon wheel, he found himself replaying their conversation. There was more to Tabitha Winters than met the eye strength beneath her gentle manner, wisdom beyond her 26 years, and a quiet resilience that he found himself admiring more with each passing day. The summer heat intensified as June gave way to July. The ranch work grew more demanding, with long days spent moving cattle to better grazing grounds and ensuring water sources didn't dry up. Ethan often returned to the house exhausted, covered in dust, his muscles aching from hours in the saddle. On one particularly grueling day, he trudged back well after dark, having spent hours searching for a missing calf. He found it eventually, stuck in a narrow ravine, frightened but unharmed. By the time he returned the calf to its mother and made his way home, the house was quiet, the kitchen dark. Ethan's heart sank at the thought of another missed meal, but as he approached the porch, he noticed a soft light still burning in the window. Curious, he stepped inside to find Tabitha sitting at the kitchen table, a book open before her, a covered plate waiting at his usual place. She looked up at his entrance, closing her book. "I was beginning to think you'd decided to sleep out under the stars," she said, rising to pour him a cup of coffee. "Found a calf stuck in Miller's ravine," Ethan explained, sinking gratefully into a chair. "Took longer than I expected to get it out." Tabitha nodded, placing the coffee before him and removing the cover from the plate to reveal a generous portion of beef stew, still warm with a thick slice of bread on the side. "Eat," she instructed simply. Too tired to argue, Ethan complied, the first bite reminding him how hungry he truly was. He ate in appreciative silence while Tabitha returned to her seat, opening her book once more. "You didn't have to wait up," he said finally, when his plate was nearly empty. Tabitha glanced up, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "I know, but no one should have to eat alone after a long day's work." The simple kindness of her statement caught Ethan off guard. For years, he'd grown accustomed to solitude, to returning to an empty house and eating whatever was left from the day's meals in silence. The companionship Tabitha offered quiet, undemanding, yet undeniably present touched something in him that had long been dormant. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the warmth spreading through his chest. Tabitha smiled, the expression softening her features. "You're welcome. Now, would you like some pie? I tried a new recipe with dried peaches." "Is that even a question that needs asking?" Ethan replied with a tired grin. As Tabitha cut him a generous slice of pie, Ethan noticed the title of her book, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. "Good book?" he asked, nodding toward it. Tabitha's eyes lit up. "One of my favorites. Have you read it?" Ethan shook his head. "Not much time for reading novels these days, though I used to enjoy it when I was younger." "What did you read then?" Tabitha asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Adventure tales mostly. Cooper's Leatherstocking series, some Dickens when my mother insisted it would be good for me." He took a bite of pie, closing his eyes briefly at the perfect balance of sweet and tart. "This is exceptional." "Thank you," Tabitha said, pleased. Then, with a hesitant smile, she added, "I could read to you sometime, if you'd like, in the evenings after dinner." Ethan considered the offer, trying to remember the last time someone had read to him. Probably his mother when he was a boy sick with fever. The idea of sitting by the fire, listening to Tabitha's voice weaving stories in the quiet evening hours, held an unexpected appeal. "I'd like that," he said finally, "though I can't promise I won't fall asleep if days like this one continue." Tabitha laughed softly. "I'll try not to take it personally if you do." As he finished his pie, Ethan found himself reluctant to end the evening. There was something peaceful about sitting across from Tabitha in the warm kitchen, the rest of the world held at bay by the circle of lamplight surrounding them. "Tell me about Boston," he said impulsively. "I've never been further east than St. Louis." If Tabitha was surprised by the request, she didn't show it. Instead, she closed her book completely, settling back in her chair. "Boston is different," she began thoughtfully. "Older, more established. The buildings stand shoulder to shoulder, brick and stone instead of wood. The streets are narrower, curving around like sheep paths rather than the straight lines you see out here." As she spoke, her hands moved expressively, painting pictures with her words. She told him about the harbor with its forest of masts, the public garden with its swan boats, the libraries and theaters and concert halls. Her descriptions were vivid enough that Ethan could almost see the city she'd left behind, so different from the open spaces and rugged beauty of the territory. "Do you miss it?" he asked when she paused. Tabitha considered the question, her head tilted slightly. "Parts of it," she admitted. "The museums, the bookshops, the changing of the seasons. Autumn in New England is truly spectacular." She looked around the simple kitchen, a small smile playing at her lips. "But there's something honest about life here. Direct. The dangers are obvious: drought, storms, illness. In Boston, the perils are often hidden behind polite smiles and proper manners." The bitterness in her last words was unmistakable, and Ethan knew she was thinking of her former fiancé. He wanted to ask what had happened, what kind of fool would choose banking over marrying a woman like Tabitha, but he sensed it was still too raw a wound to probe. Instead, he said, "Well, we're glad to have you here, hidden perils and all." Tabitha's smile widened, genuine gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that." She stood, gathering his empty plate and cup. "Now you should get some rest. Tomorrow we'll be here before you know it." Ethan rose as well, suddenly aware of how close they were standing in the small kitchen. He could smell the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to Tabitha's skin, could see the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in her green eyes. For a breathless moment, he was tempted to reach out, to brush back a strand of auburn hair that had escaped its pins. Instead, he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Good night, Tabitha, and thank you again for waiting up." She nodded, a hint of color in her cheeks suggesting she might have felt the same momentary pull. "Good night, Ethan." As he made his way to his bedroom, Ethan tried to dismiss the warmth that had bloomed in his chest during their conversation. Tabitha was his employee, nothing more. The fact that he found her increasingly fascinating, that he looked forward to their moments together with an eagerness that surprised him, was irrelevant. She had come to Las Cruces to escape a painful past. The last thing she needed was unwanted attention from her employer. Yet as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan found himself thinking of green eyes lit with intelligence, of capable hands shaping dough with loving care, and of a voice that could make even the driest description of Boston architecture sound like poetry. The next morning dawned hot and clear, promising another scorching July day. Ethan woke earlier than usual, his mind already turning to the tasks that awaited him. The eastern pasture needed attention, with fences to repair and a water trough that had been leaking for days. To his surprise, when he entered the kitchen, he found it empty. No coffee brewing, no breakfast cooking, no Tabitha bustling about with her usual energy. Concerned, he glanced at the clock on the wall. It was early, but not so early that she wouldn't normally be up and working. Hesitantly, he approached the door to her quarters and knocked softly. "Tabitha, are you all right?" There was a muffled sound from within, then Tabitha's voice, strained and hoarse. "I'm fine, I'll be out shortly." Ethan frowned. She didn't sound fine at all. "Are you ill?" he pressed. After a pause, the door opened slightly, revealing Tabitha's pale face. Her eyes were glassy, her cheeks flushed with fever. "I'm just a bit under the weather," she admitted reluctantly. "I'm sure it's nothing. If you'll give me a moment, I'll start breakfast." Ethan shook his head firmly. "Absolutely not. You're going back to bed." "But the meals can wait," Ethan finished for her. "Or I can manage something simple. I promise not to burn the house down." He tried for a light tone, but his concern was evident. "Have you taken anything for the fever?" Tabitha leaned against the doorframe, clearly lacking the energy to argue further. "There's willow bark tea in the pantry. It helps with fever." Ethan nodded. "I'll make some for you. Now back to bed. That's an order." A ghost of a smile touched Tabitha's lips. "Yes, sir," she murmured, turning back toward her bed. Ethan closed the door gently behind her, then set about locating the willow bark tea. It took him several minutes of searching before he found it, tucked away on a high shelf. As he waited for the water to boil, he contemplated the day ahead. Miguel and Josiah would be expecting breakfast when they arrived, and there were meals to prepare for the rest of the day. He could handle it, he decided. After all, he'd survived on his own cooking for a month before Tabitha arrived. Surely he could manage for a day or two while she recovered. When the tea was ready, he knocked on Tabitha's door again, entering at her weak, "Come in." She had changed into a nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders, making her look younger and more vulnerable. Ethan felt a surge of protectiveness as he set the tea on her bedside table. "Drink this," he instructed gently, "all of it. I'll check on you again before I head out to the east pasture." Tabitha nodded, sitting up slightly to take the cup. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy. "I'm sorry about this. I rarely get sick." "Nothing to apologize for," Ethan assured her. "Just focus on getting better." He hesitated, then added awkwardly, "Is there anything else you need?" "Anything I can get you," Tabitha shook her head. "Just rest, I think, and perhaps some broth later if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Ethan promised, though he wasn't entirely confident in his ability to produce edible broth. He'd figure it out somehow. He left her to rest, closing the door quietly behind him, and set about preparing a simple breakfast for himself and his hands. Oatmeal seemed straightforward enough: water, oats, a pinch of salt. He stirred carefully, remembering Tabitha's instruction from weeks before. "Patience, Ethan. Let the heat do its work." To his surprise, the oatmeal turned out reasonably well, if a bit bland compared to Tabitha's version. When Miguel and Josiah arrived, they eyed his efforts with skepticism but ate without complaint. "Miss Tabitha under the weather?" Miguel asked, noting her absence. Ethan nodded. "Fever. Nothing serious, I hope, but she needs rest." Josiah, older and more taciturn than Miguel, grunted in concern. "Town's had some cases of summer fever going around. Doc Jenkins has been busy." Ethan felt a stab of worry. Summer fevers in the territory could be serious, sometimes even fatal. "I'll ride into town and fetch the doctor if she's not improved by evening," he decided. After breakfast, he left instructions with Miguel about the day's work, then prepared a pot of chicken broth using the remains of yesterday's roast chicken. It wasn't as clear or flavorful as Tabitha's would have been, but it was hot and nourishing. He brought a bowl to her room, finding her asleep, her breathing slightly labored. Reluctant to wake her but concerned about her fever, he gently touched her shoulder. "Tabitha, I've brought some broth." She stirred, her eyes opening slowly, unfocused at first. "Ethan," she murmured, confusion evident in her voice. "Yes, it's me. I thought you should try to eat something." He helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her back. Tabitha accepted the bowl with shaky hands. "Thank you. You didn't have to go to so much trouble." Ethan watched as she took a cautious sip. "Is it terrible?" he asked, only half joking. A weak smile crossed her face. "It's good," she assured him. "Simple but good." She took another spoonful, then added, "You're learning." "I had a good teacher," Ethan replied, pleased by her approval. "Though I still wouldn't trust me with anything more complicated than boiling water." Tabitha's laugh turned into a cough, and Ethan quickly took the bowl before she could spill it. "Easy," he said, concerned by the flush in her cheeks that seemed to have deepened. When her coughing subsided, he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. "Your fever's higher. I'm going to fetch Doc Jenkins." Tabitha shook her head weakly. "It's just a summer chill. I'll be fine by tomorrow." "Let's let the doctor be the judge of that," Ethan said firmly. "I'll be back as quickly as I can. Josiah will be close by if you need anything before I return." He left instructions with Josiah to check on Tabitha regularly, then saddled his fastest horse and set off for Las Cruces. The town was a good hour's ride away, but Ethan pushed his mount hard, covering the distance in 45 minutes. Doc Jenkins's office was on the main street, a modest building with a sign proclaiming Dr. Howard Jenkins, physician and surgeon. Ethan tied his horse at the hitching post and entered without knocking, relief flooding through him when he found the doctor at his desk rather than out on a call. "Ethan Ramsey," the older man greeted him, rising from his chair. "What brings you to town in such a hurry? Not injured, I hope." "It's my cook, Miss Winters," Ethan explained quickly. "She's taken ill. High fever, coughing. Josiah mentioned there's been summer fever in town." The doctor's expression grew serious. "There has indeed. Nothing too deadly, thankfully, but it can be severe if not treated properly." He began gathering supplies into his medical bag. "I'll come at once. Is she having trouble breathing? Any delirium?" Her breathing seemed labored when I left, but no delirium that I noticed. Dr. Jenkins nodded, closing his bag with a snap. "Good. Let's go before that changes." They rode back to the ranch at a brisk pace, the doctor keeping up admirably despite his 60 years. When they arrived, Ethan led him directly to Tabitha's quarters, knocking before entering. Josiah was sitting in a chair beside her bed, his weathered face creased with worry. "Fever's gotten worse," he reported, standing to make way for the doctor. "She's been talking some nonsense about Boston and someone named Edward." Ethan felt a twist of something uncomfortable at the mention of this unknown Edward, presumably the fiancé who had chosen banking over marriage. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing on Tabitha's flushed face and restless movements. Dr. Jenkins moved to her bedside, his manner gentle but efficient as he examined her. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing with his stethoscope, felt the glands in her neck, and tested her reflexes. Finally, he straightened, his expression reassuring. "It's the summer fever, all right, but caught early enough. She's young and healthy otherwise, which is in her favor." He opened his bag, removing several bottles and packets. "This willow bark tincture is stronger than tea. Give her a spoonful every 4 hours. This powder is for the cough. Mix it with honey if you have it. Keep her cool with damp cloths and make sure she drinks plenty of fluids." Ethan nodded, committing the instructions to memory. "Is there anything else we can do?" "Just keep a close eye on her. If her breathing becomes more labored or if the fever hasn't broken by tomorrow evening, send for me again." The doctor packed his bag, then added, "Someone should stay with her through the night. The fever often peaks after sunset." "I'll stay with her," Ethan said immediately. At the doctor's raised eyebrow, he added, "She's under my employ, my responsibility." Dr. Jenkins gave him a knowing look but merely nodded. "Very well. I'll check in tomorrow if I'm passing this way." After seeing the doctor out, Ethan returned to find Josiah still sitting vigil. "I'll take over now," he told the older man. "You and Miguel focus on the east pasture work." Josiah rose, his expression thoughtful as he studied Ethan. "She means something to you, doesn't she? More than just a cook?" Ethan started to deny it automatically, then paused, considering the question. In the short time Tabitha had been at the ranch, she had become important to him. Her presence had transformed not just the quality of meals but the entire atmosphere of the place. The house felt like a home again, warm with conversation and laughter. "She's a good woman," Ethan said finally, not quite an answer. "And yes, I care what happens to her." Josiah nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Thought so, way you look at her sometimes. Reminds me of how I used to look at my Marable, God rest her soul." He clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Don't worry, boss. Miss Tabitha's strong. She'll pull through." Left alone with Tabitha, Ethan pulled the chair closer to her bedside and sat down, preparing for a long vigil. She was sleeping fitfully, occasional murmurs escaping her lips. Once she called out clearly, "Edward, please," the pain in her voice making Ethan wince. "SHH," he soothed, dampening a cloth in the basin of cool water Josiah had brought and placing it gently on her forehead. "You're safe. Everything's all right." At the sound of his voice, Tabitha seemed to calm, her restless movements stilling. Ethan continued talking softly, not sure if she could hear him but finding comfort in the act of speaking. He told her about the ranch, about his plans for expanding the herd, about the years he'd spent building something from the modest inheritance his father had left him. As dusk fell, he lit a lamp and continued his watch. True to the doctor's prediction, Tabitha's fever seemed to intensify with the night. She thrashed in her bed, sometimes calling out in distress, other times lying so still that Ethan had to lean close to ensure she was still breathing. He administered the medicine as directed, supporting her head as she swallowed, wiping her brow with cool cloths, and encouraging her to sip water whenever she was lucid enough to do so. The hours stretched endlessly, each minute a battle against the fever that held her in its grip. Sometime after midnight, in a moment of clarity, Tabitha opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he assured her, taking her hand without thinking, her fingers curled weakly around his. "Don't leave." "I won't," he promised. "Not until you're better." A faint smile touched her lips before her eyes fluttered closed again, but her hand remained in his, a tenuous connection that Ethan found himself unwilling to break. He sat there, her small hand cradled in his much larger one, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, and realized with startling clarity that the thought of losing her terrified him in a way he hadn't experienced since his parents' deaths. It wasn't just that she was an excellent cook, or that the ranch ran more smoothly with her presence. It was Tabitha herself, her quiet strength, her gentle humor, her kindness that extended to everyone around her. Somewhere in the weeks since her arrival, she had become essential to him in a way that had nothing to do with her skills in the kitchen. The realization should have alarmed him. Instead, it settled into his heart with the comfortable weight of truth long acknowledged. Whatever was growing between them, this fragile, unnamed thing, it mattered. She mattered. And so Ethan kept his vigil through the long night, one hand holding hers, the other regularly replacing the cool cloth on her forehead, his whispered reassurances filling the quiet room as he waited for dawn and the hope it might bring. Morning came with a soft golden light filtering through the curtains. Ethan, who had dozed off sometime in the early hours, jerked awake at the sound of Tabitha stirring. He straightened in his chair, his back protesting the awkward position, and leaned forward to check her condition. To his immense relief, her face was cooler to the touch, the unnatural flush faded from her cheeks. Her eyes, when they opened, were clear and focused. "Good morning," she said, her voice weak but steady. "Have you been here all night?" Ethan nodded, suddenly self-conscious about their still linked hands. He made to pull away, but Tabitha's fingers tightened slightly around his. "Thank you," she said simply. "How are you feeling?" he asked, searching her face for signs of lingering fever. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted with a weak smile. "But better. The fever's broken, I think." Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. "It has. You had me worried for a while there." Tabitha's expression softened. "I'm sorry to have been such trouble." "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan said firmly. "You couldn't help getting sick, and it's no trouble to care for someone who—" He hesitated, suddenly unsure how to finish the sentence. "Who burns fewer meals than you do," Tabitha suggested, a hint of her usual humor returning. Ethan laughed, the tension easing. "Exactly. Can't have my one competent cook succumbing to summer fever." Tabitha's smile widened, though her eyes held a question he wasn't ready to answer. After a moment, she glanced around the room. "What time is it? I should prepare breakfast." "It's barely dawn," Ethan assured her. "And you're not preparing anything today except to rest and recover. Doctor's orders." "But no arguments," Ethan interrupted. "I managed yesterday and I can manage today. The ranch won't fall apart if you take a day to recuperate." Tabitha looked like she might protest further, but a fit of coughing overtook her, proving his point. When it subsided, she nodded reluctantly. "Perhaps you're right, But promise me you won't try anything complicated. Stick to oatmeal and eggs." "I promise not to exceed my very limited abilities," Ethan said solemnly, then added with a grin, "Though I did make a decent pot of chicken broth yesterday. Even you said it was good." "And so it was," Tabitha agreed, her expression warm. "You see, you're not completely hopeless in the kitchen after all." Something about the way she said it with genuine belief in his capability touched Ethan deeply. Throughout his life, he'd been told what he couldn't do. Couldn't manage the ranch on his own after his father died, couldn't expand the herd successfully, couldn't make a go of it without a wife to manage the household. He'd proven them all wrong except for the cooking part. Yet here was Tabitha, seeing potential where others saw only failure. "With your instruction, maybe not," he conceded, "but I'm still a long way from being trusted with anything important." Tabitha's gaze held his, surprisingly serious. "You underestimate yourself, Ethan Ramsey. You managed this ranch for years before I arrived. You've built something remarkable here, and you kept me alive last night with your care." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'd say that's more important than whether you can bake a perfect loaf of bread." Ethan felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. Before he could respond, a knock at the outer door broke the moment. He reluctantly released her hand and stood. "That'll be Miguel or Josiah checking in. You rest. I'll bring you some tea and toast once I've sorted breakfast for the men." Tabitha nodded, settling back against her pillows. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He paused at the door, looking back at her pale but improving, her auburn hair spread across the pillow, her green eyes warm with gratitude and something else he dared not name. "You're welcome, Tabitha, always." The next several days passed in a blur of activity, as Ethan balanced his usual ranch duties with caring for Tabitha and managing the meals. Miguel and Josiah pitched in more than usual, handling tasks that would normally have required Ethan's supervision, giving him time to check on Tabitha throughout the day and prepare simple meals for the household. To everyone's relief, Tabitha's recovery progressed steadily. By the third day, she was able to sit in the kitchen for short periods, instructing Ethan on how to prepare more substantial meals than his usual oatmeal and eggs. There was something intimate about these cooking lessons, with Tabitha perched on a chair by the stove, her voice still slightly hoarse as she guided him through the steps of making a proper stew or baking bread that didn't resemble stone. "No, slower with the stirring," she corrected gently as Ethan attacked a pot of beans with more enthusiasm than skill. "You're not trying to beat them into submission." Ethan slowed his movements, glancing at her for approval. "Better," she nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "Much." "You're learning." "I have an excellent teacher," he replied, returning her smile. "Though I'm still amazed anything edible comes from my efforts." Tabitha laughed, the sound still weak but genuine. "The secret is paying attention. Food tells you what it needs if you listen carefully enough." "I think it's been screaming for help whenever I enter the kitchen," Ethan joked, carefully adding salt as she had instructed. "Well, now it's whispering instead of screaming. Progress." Tabitha's eyes danced with mirth. "You'll be a passable cook yet, Ethan Ramsey." "Heaven forbid," he replied with mock horror. "If word gets out that I can cook, you might find yourself out of a job." Tabitha's smile faltered slightly, and Ethan immediately regretted his words. "I didn't mean, I know," she assured him quickly. "And truly, it's good that you're learning. Everyone should know how to prepare a decent meal." There was a brief, awkward silence, broken when Miguel poked his head into the kitchen. "Boss, that cattle buyer from Santa Fe is here. Says he wants to discuss the fall delivery." Ethan nodded, wiping his hands on a towel. "I'll be right there." He turned to Tabitha. "Will you be all right for a bit?" "Of course," she said, waving him away. "I'll keep an eye on the beans. Go tend to your business." The meeting with the cattle buyer took longer than expected, with detailed negotiations about pricing and delivery schedules. By the time Ethan returned to the kitchen, Tabitha had somehow managed to transform his rudimentary bean pot into a flavorful meal, complete with cornbread that smelled heavenly. "You shouldn't have," Ethan chided gently, noting the touch of fatigue around her eyes. "You're supposed to be resting." Tabitha shrugged, a hint of stubbornness in her expression. "I've rested plenty. Besides, I only added a few ingredients to what you started. The cornbread was simple enough." Ethan knew better than to argue. In the weeks he'd known her, he'd learned that Tabitha's delicate appearance belied a will of iron. Instead, he said, "It smells wonderful. Thank you." Her pleased smile was reward enough for conceding the point. As they sat down to eat, joined by Miguel and Josiah, who praised the meal enthusiastically, Ethan found himself watching Tabitha. Color had returned to her cheeks, and though she was still thinner than before her illness, her eyes were bright with their usual intelligence and humor. Something had shifted between them during those long hours of her fever, a deepening of connection that neither had acknowledged directly, but that hummed in the background of their every interaction. After dinner, as Miguel and Josiah headed to their quarters for the night, Ethan helped Tabitha clear the table despite her protests that she could manage. "You're still recovering," he reminded her. "Doc Jenkins said not to overdo it." Tabitha sighed but relented, sinking into a chair while Ethan handled the dishes with surprising competence. "You've become quite domestic," she observed, a teasing note in her voice. "Next thing I know, you'll be embroidering pillowcases." Ethan laughed, setting the last clean plate on the shelf. "I draw the line at needlework, but I've found there's something satisfying about cooking when the results are actually edible, thanks to your instruction." Tabitha inclined her head, accepting the compliment. "You're a quick study when you choose to be." "Only because failure wasn't an option," Ethan replied, his tone more serious than he'd intended. "Not when it came to taking care of you." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd meant them to be. Tabitha's eyes widened slightly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "That's very kind of you to say," she said finally, her voice soft. Ethan moved to sit across from her at the table, gathering his courage. "Tabitha, during your illness I realized something." She looked at him expectantly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Yes. I realized how much you've come to mean to me, to all of us," he amended quickly, losing his nerve at the last moment. "The ranch hasn't been the same since you arrived. It's been better, warmer." Tabitha's expression was unreadable for a moment before she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm glad. I've grown fond of this place too, and everyone in it." There was something in her voice that suggested she might have hoped for more specific words, but Ethan couldn't bring himself to be more direct. Not yet. The memory of her calling out for Edward during her fever was still fresh in his mind, a reminder that she had come to Las Cruces to heal from heartbreak. The last thing she needed was her employer developing feelings for her. Instead, he said, "Well, you should get some rest. Tomorrow's Sunday, why don't we ride into town for church if you're feeling up to it? Might do you good to get some fresh air." Tabitha nodded, rising from her chair. "I'd like that. Thank you, Ethan, for everything these past few days." "No need to thank me," he replied, standing as well. "Just doing what anyone would do." "No," Tabitha said firmly, meeting his gaze directly. "Not anyone. You." She hesitated, then stepped forward and, standing on tiptoe, placed a gentle kiss on his cheek. "Good night, Ethan." Before he could respond, she had disappeared into her quarters, leaving him standing in the kitchen, his cheek tingling from the brief contact, his heart hammering in his chest like a young colt kicking at a stall door. Sunday dawned clear and bright, the summer heat tempered by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and juniper. Tabitha emerged from her quarters dressed in her best blue dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet. The sight of her, healthy and smiling, filled Ethan with a contentment he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "You look well," he said as he helped her into the wagon. It was a simple observation, but the warmth in his voice made it sound like much more. "I feel well," Tabitha replied, settling her skirts around her. "It's good to be up and about properly again." The ride into Las Cruces was pleasant, the conversation flowing easily between them as they discussed ranch matters, the weather, and Tabitha's plans for a small kitchen garden. Ethan found himself laughing more than usual at her witty observations about Western life compared to Boston society. "In Boston, calling hours are strictly observed," she explained. "One doesn't simply drop by a neighbor's home unannounced, as Thomas did that first day he brought me to your ranch." Ethan chuckled. "Out here, if you waited for a formal invitation, you might never see another soul. Distance makes formality impractical." "I rather prefer it," Tabitha admitted. "The directness." In Boston, people can spend an entire conversation saying nothing of substance, all while maintaining perfect politeness. "Sounds exhausting," Ethan commented, guiding the wagon around a rut in the road. Tabitha's smile turned wistful. "It was. I didn't realize how much until I came here." She glanced at him sideways. "People here say what they mean. You say what you mean." There was a question in her statement, one that Ethan wasn't sure how to answer. Before he could formulate a response, they arrived in town, the church bell already ringing to summon the faithful. Las Cruces was a growing community, with a mix of adobe buildings in the Mexican style and newer wooden structures built by Eastern settlers. The church was one of the more impressive buildings, with a modest steeple and freshly painted white clapboard siding. Wagons and horses lined the street outside, townspeople in their Sunday best greeting each other as they filed inside. Ethan helped Tabitha down from the wagon, conscious of her still recovering strength. As they made their way toward the church, they were stopped by familiar voices calling their names. Thomas Wilson hurried toward them, his round face beaming beneath his Sunday hat. "Tabitha, my dear, and Ethan, how wonderful to see you both." He embraced his niece warmly, then stepped back to examine her. "You're looking much better than when I visited during your illness. Ethan here must be taking good care of you." Tabitha smiled, her eyes meeting Ethan's briefly. "He has been. I couldn't ask for a better nurse." Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly at this, a knowing expression crossing his face. "Indeed. Well, I'm delighted to hear it." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "There's been some talk in town, you know, about a young lady living at a bachelor's ranch. But I've assured everyone that Ethan is a gentleman through and through." Tabitha's cheeks colored faintly, while Ethan cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There are ranch hands living on the property as well," he pointed out. "It's hardly improper." Of course," Thomas agreed hastily. "I never thought otherwise. Now, shall we go in?" Reverend Phillips gives a mercifully brief sermon, and Mrs. Phillips has organized a picnic luncheon afterward. As they entered the church, Ethan was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. He'd never been one for town gossip, but he understood now why Thomas had felt the need to defend Tabitha's presence at his ranch. Small communities thrived on talk, and a single woman living under the roof of an unmarried man, regardless of the circumstances, was bound to raise eyebrows. The service passed quickly, as Thomas had promised. Reverend Phillips's sermon focused on the parable of the Good Samaritan, emphasizing the virtue of helping strangers in need. Ethan found himself reflecting on how Tabitha had come into his life as a stranger, and how quickly she had become essential to it. After the service, the congregation moved to a grassy area beside the church, where tables had been set up for the picnic. Food was plentiful, with each family contributing dishes that showcased their particular skills. Tabitha, still not fully recovered, had not been able to prepare anything, a fact she lamented quietly to Ethan. "Next time," he assured her. Your health is more important than impressing the townsfolk with your cooking." She smiled gratefully at his understanding. "Still, I feel as though I'm not pulling my weight." "You've more than earned a day off," Ethan replied firmly. "Besides, this gives you a chance to taste other people's cooking for a change." They filled their plates and found seats at one of the tables, soon joined by Thomas and several other townspeople eager to meet Tabitha properly. Ethan watched with pride as she charmed everyone with her genuine warmth and intelligent conversation. She belonged here, he realized with sudden clarity, not just at his ranch but in this community, among these people who were already beginning to value her as he did. As the afternoon progressed, Ethan found himself drawn into a discussion about cattle prices with several other ranchers, while Tabitha was surrounded by a group of women who seemed to be peppering her with questions. Occasionally, he would glance her way, catching her eye across the gathering. Each time, she would smile in a way that felt like a private communication between them, a silent acknowledgement of their growing connection. It was during one of these moments that Ethan noticed a tall, well-dressed man approach Tabitha. From his expensive suit and Eastern manner, it was clear he wasn't a local. Ethan watched as Tabitha's expression froze, her smile fading into shock. Excusing himself from his conversation, Ethan made his way toward her, an inexplicable sense of unease driving his steps. As he drew nearer, he could hear the stranger speaking, his cultured voice carrying an unmistakable note of condescension. "Quite the charming rustic gathering, isn't it? Though hardly what you're accustomed to in Boston." Tabitha's reply was too low to catch, but her posture had stiffened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Tabitha," Ethan said as he reached her side, deliberately using her first name, "is everything all right?" She looked up at him, relief evident in her eyes. "Ethan." "Yes, I." "This is Mr. Edward Blackwell, from Boston." The slight tremor in her voice didn't escape Ethan's notice. "Edward, this is Mr. Ethan Ramsey. I work as his cook." Edward Blackwell, the fiancé who had chosen banking over marriage. Ethan sized up the man before him. Tall, handsome in a conventional way, with the smug self-assurance of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. "Ah, Mr. Ramsey," Blackwell said, extending his hand with practiced politeness. "A pleasure. I understand you've been employing Miss Winters these past weeks." Ethan shook the offered hand briefly, noting the soft palm that spoke of a life without physical labor. "Miss Winters has been an invaluable addition to my ranch," he said, his tone making it clear he valued Tabitha far beyond her cooking skills. Blackwell's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, well, that's actually why I'm here. I've come to bring Tabitha back to Boston." Tabitha made a small sound of disbelief. "Edward, I told you in my letter that I had no intention of returning." "Darling, you were upset," Blackwell said dismissively. "Understandably so, but surely you've had time to reconsider. Your father is worried about you, and frankly, the idea of you working as a cook in this wilderness is absurd." Ethan felt a surge of protective anger at the way Blackwell spat the word cook, as if it were beneath contempt. Before he could speak, Tabitha rose to her feet, her green eyes flashing with a fire Ethan had never seen before. "This wilderness, as you call it, has shown me more genuine kindness in 2 months than Boston society did in 26 years, she said, her voice low but intense. "And cooking is honorable work that brings comfort and nourishment to others. Unlike banking, which seems to primarily benefit oneself." Blackwell's expression darkened. "You're being childish, Tabitha. Your place is in Boston as my wife." "I've explained about the misunderstanding with Miss Harrington. It meant nothing. The misunderstanding being that you were courting her while engaged to me." Tabitha's voice was steady now, growing stronger with each word. "No, Edward. I'm not returning to Boston, and I'm certainly not marrying you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm enjoying this rustic gathering with people I actually respect." She turned to Ethan, her face composed despite the emotion evident in her eyes. "Would you mind terribly if we left a bit early? I'm feeling rather tired." "Of course," Ethan agreed immediately, offering his arm, which she took with a grateful smile. Blackwell stepped forward, his carefully cultivated charm giving way to anger. "This is ridiculous, Tabitha. You can't possibly prefer this life to what I'm offering you." Ethan felt Tabitha's grip on his arm tighten. "Mr. Blackwell," he said evenly, "Miss Winters has made her wishes clear. I suggest you respect them." "And who are you to interfere?" Blackwell demanded. "Her employer, or is there more to it than that?" The implication hung in the air, drawing curious glances from nearby picnickers. Ethan felt a cold fury rise within him at the thinly veiled insult to Tabitha's character. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I'm going to pretend I didn't hear what you just implied about Miss Winters. But if you ever speak of her in such a manner again, you and I will have a reckoning that you won't enjoy." Blackwell took a step back, clearly unaccustomed to being threatened. "This isn't over, Tabitha," he said stiffly. "I'll be staying at the hotel in town. When you come to your senses, you know where to find me." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, his rigid posture betraying his anger. Ethan looked down at Tabitha, concerned by the pallor that had returned to her face. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her hand still trembled slightly on his arm. "Yes." "I'm sorry you had to witness that. Edward has always had difficulty accepting when things don't go his way." "You have nothing to apologize for," Ethan assured her. He glanced around, noting the curious stares they were attracting. "Let's say our goodbyes and head back to the ranch." As they made their farewells, Ethan couldn't help noticing how protectively Tabitha was treated by the townsfolk who had only just met her. Mrs. Phillips pressed an extra basket of food into her hands for strength. Thomas Wilson promised to visit soon to check on her. Even gruff Sheriff Donovan made a point of saying he'd keep an eye on that Eastern feller during his stay in Las Cruces. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Tabitha lost in thought as the wagon rumbled along the dusty road. Ethan respected her silence, understanding that Edward Blackwell's unexpected appearance had stirred up painful memories. Finally, as they neared the ranch, Tabitha spoke. "I should explain about Edward." "You don't owe me any explanations," Ethan said gently. "Perhaps not. But I'd like to tell you nonetheless." She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Edward and I became engaged last winter. It was what was expected. Our families have known each other for years. We moved in the same social circles, and on paper, we were a suitable match." She paused, looking out at the landscape passing by. "I wasn't in love with him, not really, but I thought we shared similar values and goals. I was wrong." Her voice hardened slightly. 3 weeks before our wedding, I discovered he had been pursuing Catherine Harrington, a wealthy shipping heiress, throughout our engagement. When confronted, he admitted it readily enough, claiming it was merely business, that the Harrington connection would benefit his banking career. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. "And he expected you to accept this?" "Oh yes," Tabitha said with a humorless laugh. He seemed genuinely surprised that I objected. In his world, marriages are primarily business arrangements. The fact that I expected fidelity was apparently naive. "It's not naive to expect basic decency," Ethan said firmly. Tabitha gave him a grateful smile. "No, but in certain circles of Boston society, it's considered rather old-fashioned. After I broke the engagement, there was quite the scandal. Edward's family is influential, and soon there were whispers that I had been the one at fault, too provincial in my thinking, too rigid in my expectations." "That's absurd," Ethan said, outraged on her behalf. "It's Boston," Tabitha replied with a shrug. "My father, bless him, stood by me, but even he suggested that perhaps I had overreacted. When Uncle Thomas wrote that he needed help in his store, I seized the opportunity to escape. They had reached the ranch now, the familiar buildings a welcome sight after the tensions of the day. Ethan brought the wagon to a halt in front of the house, turning to face Tabitha fully. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you made the right decision. Any man who can't recognize your worth doesn't deserve your hand." Tabitha's eyes met his, a vulnerability in them that made his heart ache. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Impulsively, Ethan reached out to take her hand. "Tabitha, Miss Winters," Miguel's voice interrupted as he jogged toward the wagon. "You're back. How are you feeling?" "Better, I hope." The moment broken, Ethan released Tabitha's hand and climbed down from the wagon to help her descend. "Much better, thank you, Miguel," she replied, her composure quickly restored. "And I see you've been keeping things in order while we were gone." As Miguel proudly detailed the chores he and Josiah had completed in their absence, Ethan found himself both frustrated by the interruption and grateful for it. What had he been about to say? That he was falling in love with her, that Edward Blackwell was a fool, that he wanted her to stay at the ranch not as his cook, but as something more. The thoughts swirled in his mind, unsettling in their intensity. Tabitha had just faced down the man who had betrayed her trust. The last thing she needed was another man making demands on her heart. Better to give her time, to let her heal fully from both her illness and her emotional wounds before revealing the depth of his feelings. Yet as he watched her chat with Miguel, her face animated despite the fatigue evident in the set of her shoulders, Ethan knew with growing certainty that his heart was already hers, whether he spoke the words aloud or not. The days following the church picnic fell into a rhythm that was both familiar and new. Tabitha resumed her duties in the kitchen, though Ethan insisted she continue to rest more than usual until her strength fully returned. Edward Blackwell's presence in Las Cruces cast a shadow over their peace, though he had made no further attempt to contact Tabitha directly. "Thomas says he's been asking questions all over town," Tabitha reported one evening as she and Ethan sat on the porch after dinner, enjoying the cooler air. "About me, about the ranch, about you." Ethan frowned, his hand tightening around his coffee cup. "What kind of questions?" "The kind designed to paint me as a woman who has lost her way and needs rescuing," Tabitha said with a sigh. "And you as a rough frontier type taking advantage of my vulnerable state." "That's ridiculous," Ethan said indignantly. "Anyone who knows either of us would never believe such nonsense." Fortunately, Las Cruces seems quite immune to Edward's particular brand of charm, Tabitha agreed with a small smile. "Mrs. Phillips apparently told him in no uncertain terms that I seemed perfectly content where I was, and that he would do well to return to Boston and leave me be." Ethan chuckled, picturing the formidable minister's wife facing down the polished Easterner. Good for her. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the sunset painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. It was a view Ethan had seen thousands of times, yet somehow sharing it with Tabitha made it feel new again. "You think he'll give up and leave?" Ethan asked finally, voicing the question that had been on his mind. Tabitha considered this, her expression thoughtful. "Eventually. Edward doesn't handle rejection well, but he's also not accustomed to prolonged discomfort. The hotel in town is hardly up to his standards, and he finds the heat intolerable." A smile tugged at her lips. "He complained endlessly about the dust ruining his boots when I saw him in town yesterday." Ethan turned to her in surprise. "You saw him. You didn't mention that." "It wasn't worth mentioning," Tabitha said with a dismissive wave. "I was at the general store purchasing supplies when he came in. He tried again to convince me to return to Boston. I declined again, and that was that." There was something in her tone that suggested there was more to the encounter than she was sharing, but Ethan didn't press the issue. Well, I hope for all our sakes that he leaves sooner rather than later. His presence is clearly upsetting to you. Tabitha's gaze was direct as she replied, less than you might think. Seeing Edward again has confirmed what I already knew, that leaving Boston was the right decision. She glanced out at the landscape, her expression softening. I found something here that I never had there, a sense of belonging. The quiet conviction in her voice stirred something deep in Ethan's chest. He wanted to tell her that she did belong here with the land, with the community, with him, but caution held him back. Instead, he said, I'm glad. The territory isn't for everyone, but for those who love it, there's no place better. No, Tabitha agreed softly, her eyes meeting his. There isn't. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken words and growing feelings. Then, from inside the house, the clock chimed 9, breaking the spell. I should turn in, Tabitha said, rising from her chair. Tomorrow is baking day, and I want to get an early start. Ethan stood as well, reluctant to see the evening end, but knowing she still needed her rest. Good night, then. Sleep well. You too, Ethan. She hesitated, then added, thank you for everything. As she disappeared into the house, Ethan remained on the porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The conversation had left him with a sense of both hope and frustration. Hope that Tabitha truly felt she belonged here. Frustration at his own inability to tell her how central she had become to his vision of the future. He was still standing there, lost in thought, when the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Instinctively, his hand moved to the revolver he kept at his hip, a necessary precaution in a territory where danger could arrive without warning. The rider came into view, and Ethan relaxed slightly as he recognized Thomas Wilson's sturdy frame. It was unusual for Thomas to visit so late, suggesting news that couldn't wait until morning. Evening, Thomas, Ethan called as the older man dismounted. What brings you out this way at this hour? Thomas's normally jovial face was serious as he climbed the porch steps. Trouble, I'm afraid. That Boston fellow Blackwell, he's been spreading some ugly rumors in town. Ethan's jaw tightened. What kind of rumors? Thomas glanced toward the house, lowering his voice. The kind no decent man would repeat about a lady, especially my niece, implying that her position here is not what it seems. He cleared his throat awkwardly. That you and she have an arrangement of a personal nature. Hot anger surged through Ethan. That's a damned lie, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Tabitha is above reproach, and everyone in Las Cruces knows it. Of course she is, Thomas agreed hastily. And most folks are dismissing it as the spite of a rejected suitor, but I thought you should know, especially since. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Since what? Ethan pressed. Thomas sighed. Since Blackwell has apparently challenged you to a duel if you don't release Tabitha from her employment so she can return to Boston with him. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. A duel? What century does he think this is? He's been drinking heavily at the saloon, Thomas explained. I suspect that's fueling some of this nonsense, but he seems genuinely convinced that you're somehow preventing Tabitha from returning to him. That's absurd, Ethan said flatly. Tabitha is here of her own free will. She can leave any time she chooses. Thomas nodded, relief evident in his expression. That's what I told Sheriff Donovan, but I wanted to make sure you were aware of the situation. Blackwell may be a fool, but he's a dangerous one with his pride wounded. Ethan paced the length of the porch, his mind racing. Does Tabitha know about any of this? No, Thomas said firmly. And I'd prefer to keep it that way if possible. She's been through enough because of that man. Ethan nodded in agreement. I'll handle Blackwell. There won't be any duels, but I'll make it clear that his behavior is unacceptable. Thomas looked relieved. I knew I could count on your good sense, Ethan. Tabitha is fortunate to have found employment with a man of your character." After Thomas departed, Ethan remained on the porch for a long time, his thoughts turbulent. The idea that anyone would spread lies about Tabitha, questioning her virtue and dignity, filled him with a rage he hadn't experienced in years. Yet beneath the anger was a deeper concern that Blackwell's actions might drive Tabitha away from Las Cruces, away from the ranch, away from him. The thought was intolerable. In the months since she had walked into his kitchen and taken over his disastrous attempts at cooking, Tabitha had become essential to his happiness in a way no one had been since his parents died. The idea of returning to life without her quiet strength, her gentle humor, her unassuming competence that made the ranch feel like a home again, it left a hollow feeling in his chest. Ethan made his decision. Tomorrow, he would ride into town and confront Edward Blackwell directly. Not with guns or fists, but with the truth. That Tabitha was her own woman, free to make her own choices, and that her place was wherever she decided it to be. And perhaps, if he found the courage, he would finally tell her that he hoped she would choose to stay not as his cook, but as something far more important. Morning found Ethan in the barn, saddling his horse earlier than usual. He had spent a restless night, his mind churning with thoughts of Blackwell's slander and what it might mean for Tabitha if the rumors spread beyond Las Cruces. Going somewhere. Tabitha's voice startled him as she appeared in the barn doorway, a basket over her arm. Ethan straightened, forcing a casual tone. "Just some business in town. I shouldn't be long." Tabitha studied his face, her perceptiveness reading more than he intended to reveal. This wouldn't have anything to do with Edward, would it? Thomas looked rather serious when he left last night. Ethan hesitated, torn between protecting her from Blackwell's ugliness and respecting her right to know what was being said about her. "Blackwell's been causing some trouble," he admitted finally. "I think it's time someone had a frank conversation with him." Tabitha set her basket down, her expression hardening. What kind of trouble? Seeing no way around it, Ethan told her the truth, though he softened the worst of Blackwell's insinuations. As he spoke, Tabitha's face paled, then flushed with anger. That despicable, arrogant. She took a deep breath, visibly collecting herself. "Well, that settles it. I'm coming with you." "Tabitha, no," Ethan protested. "This isn't something you should have to deal with." "On the contrary," she replied firmly, "it's exactly what I should deal with. These are lies about me, Ethan. My reputation, my choices. I won't hide at the ranch while you fight my battles." There was a fierce determination in her eyes that Ethan recognized all too well. She would not be dissuaded, and perhaps she was right. This was her fight as much as his. "All right," he conceded. "But I want you to let me speak to him first. Blackwell is unstable, especially when he's been drinking." Tabitha nodded her agreement. "I'll change into my riding skirt. Will you wait for me?" "Of course." As she hurried back to the house, Ethan continued preparing his horse, adding a second saddle for Tabitha's mount. Whatever happened in town today, he was determined that Blackwell would understand once, and for all that Tabitha was not returning to Boston, not now, not ever. The ride into Las Cruces was tense, both of them lost in thought as they considered what lay ahead. When they reached town, Ethan directed their horses toward the modest hotel where Blackwell was staying. "Let's check here first," he suggested. "If he's not in his room, we'll try the saloon." The hotel owner, Mrs. Delaney, greeted them with surprise. "Mr. Ramsey, Miss Winters, what brings you to town on a Tuesday?" "We're looking for Mr. Blackwell," Ethan explained. "Is he in?" Mrs. Delaney's expression turned sour. "That one? No, he's not. Checked out first thing this morning, complaining about the accommodations the entire time as if I was running some flea-ridden flophouse instead of the finest hotel in Las Cruces." Tabitha exchanged a startled look with Ethan. "He's left town. Headed for Santa Fe on the morning stage, Mrs. Delaney confirmed. Good riddance, if you ask me. Never met a more disagreeable guest in all my years of innkeeping. Relief washed over Ethan, followed quickly by suspicion. It seemed too convenient that Blackwell would leave just as his rumors were beginning to circulate. Did he say why he was leaving so suddenly? Mrs. Delaney's eyes twinkled with mischief. Well, he didn't say it to me directly, but I couldn't help overhearing him muttering about uncivilized Western barbarians and how he'd see to it properly from a distance, whatever that means. Tabitha's brow furrowed. That doesn't sound like Edward admitting defeat. No, Ethan agreed. It sounds like he's changing tactics. They thanked Mrs. Delaney and stepped back onto the boardwalk, both trying to make sense of this new development. Ethan was about to suggest they visit Sheriff Donovan for more information when Thomas Wilson hailed them from across the street. Tabitha. Ethan. Just the people I was hoping to find, he called, hurrying toward them with an envelope in his hand. This came for you, Tabitha, by special messenger from Santa Fe. Arrived not 10 minutes ago. Tabitha accepted the envelope with a frown, noting the expensive paper and elegant handwriting. It's from Edward, she confirmed, breaking the seal and unfolding the letter within. As she read, her expression changed from confusion to disbelief to outrage. Of all the underhanded, manipulative. She thrust the letter at Ethan, too angry to continue. Ethan scanned the contents, his own temper rising with each line. Blackwell had written that he was returning to Boston to set matters right with Tabitha's father, implying that Professor Winters would be horrified to learn of his daughter's current situation. He suggested that, unless Tabitha returned to Boston immediately, her father would likely travel west himself to rescue her from her unfortunate circumstances. He's trying to use my father against me, Tabitha said, her voice tight with anger. As if Papa would ever. She trailed off, uncertainty crossing her features, though he might worry if Edward presents things in a certain light. What will you do? Thomas asked, concern evident in his kind face. Tabitha straightened her shoulders, determination replacing doubt. I'll write to Father immediately, explaining everything truthfully before Edward can poison his mind with lies. She looked at Ethan. Would you mind terribly if I return to the ranch? I want to compose the letter while my thoughts are clear. Of course, Ethan agreed. I'll help you in any way I can. As they prepared to leave town, a new thought struck Ethan. Tabitha, wait, there's another option you might consider. She looked at him questioningly. What's that? Ethan hesitated, aware that what he was about to suggest was significant, potentially life-changing for both of them. You could invite your father to visit, to see for himself what your life is like here. Tabitha's eyes widened at the suggestion. You would welcome my father to the ranch. Of course, Ethan said simply. He's your family. Something soft and wondering entered Tabitha's expression. Ethan Ramsey, she said quietly, you continue to surprise me in the most wonderful ways. Thomas, watching this exchange with barely concealed delight, clapped his hands together. Excellent idea. Professor Winters should see the territory for himself and meet the people who have come to care so deeply for his daughter. The emphasis he placed on people left little doubt as to his meaning, causing Ethan to flush slightly and Tabitha to become suddenly interested in adjusting her horse's bridle. On the ride back to the ranch, they discussed the logistics of inviting Professor Winters to visit. The journey from Boston was long and costly, but not insurmountable. Father has never traveled west of the Mississippi, Tabitha mused. He's always been curious about the territories, though his academic responsibilities keep him tied to Harvard most of the year. Summer break, Ethan suggested. That would give him several weeks to travel here and back. Tabitha nodded thoughtfully. Yes, that might work, and he would see the ranch at its best with everything green from the summer rains. There was something deeply significant about planning for her father's visit, about the assumption that Tabitha would still be at the ranch months from now. It spoke of permanence, of a future that included both of them together. As they approached the ranch, Tabitha suddenly asked, "Why did you do it, Ethan?" "Do what?" "Take me on as your cook that day. You were clearly skeptical about hiring a city woman from Boston. What changed your mind?" Ethan considered the question, remembering the morning she had arrived with Thomas, how his initial reluctance had given way to something else entirely when she had walked into his kitchen and taken command of his disastrous breakfast attempt. "I was hungry," he said finally, a smile tugging at his lips, "and you promised food that wasn't burnt beyond recognition." Tabitha laughed, the sound bright in the clear air. "A man driven by his stomach, how disappointingly practical." "Well, there was also the matter of your eyes," Ethan continued, his voice softer. "I'd never seen that particular shade of green before, like spring leaves in the sunlight." Tabitha's laughter faded, replaced by a look of quiet wonder. "Oh," she said simply. They had reached the ranch now, the familiar buildings a welcome sight after the tensions of the morning. As Ethan helped Tabitha down from her horse, their hands lingered together longer than strictly necessary. "Tabitha," he began, gathering his courage. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you, Miss Tabitha." Miguel's voice interrupted as he jogged toward them, his expression unusually serious. "There's been an accident. Josiah fell from the roof of the storage shed while making repairs. His ankle's pretty bad. We've got him in the bunkhouse." Ethan immediately shifted into action, pushing his personal feelings aside. "Tabitha, can you gather medical supplies? I'll go see how bad it is." She nodded, already moving toward the house. "I'll bring everything to the bunkhouse." As they separated, each focused on the immediate crisis, Ethan couldn't help feeling that an opportunity had been lost. Yet as he hurried to Josiah's side, he consoled himself with the knowledge that there would be other moments. Tabitha wasn't leaving, not for Boston, not for anywhere. Of that, at least, he was certain. The weeks following Edward Blackwell's departure from Las Cruces brought a renewed sense of peace to the ranch. Josiah's ankle proved to be sprained rather than broken, and under Tabitha's careful nursing, he was back on light duty within days. Tabitha's letter to her father had been sent, along with a formal invitation to visit the ranch during his summer break. Now, all they could do was wait for his response. In the meantime, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Summer was in full bloom, bringing afternoon thunderstorms that transformed the landscape into a tapestry of green and gold. The cattle grew fat on the abundant grass, and the ranch prospered under Ethan's careful management. Tabitha, fully recovered from her illness, threw herself into her work with renewed energy. The small herb garden she had planted behind the kitchen was flourishing, providing fresh flavors for her increasingly ambitious meals. She had also begun teaching Ethan more complex cooking techniques during quiet evenings, their hands occasionally brushing as she demonstrated the proper way to knead bread or fold pastry. These moments of casual intimacy had become the highlight of Ethan's days. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside Tabitha in the kitchen, learning skills he'd never imagined mastering, watching her face light up with pride when he succeeded at a particularly challenging recipe. "You're a natural," she declared one evening after he produced a batch of biscuits that were actually light and fluffy rather than his usual hockey pucks. "A few more lessons and you might not need me at all." "I'll always need you," Ethan replied without thinking, the words escaping before he could consider their weight. Tabitha paused in the act of washing dishes, her hands going still in the soapy water. "Will you?" she asked softly, not turning to face him. Ethan moved to stand beside her at the sink, close enough that his sleeve brushed her shoulder. "Yes," he said simply, "but not just for your cooking." She looked up at him then, her eyes searching his face. "Why then?" It was the opening he'd been waiting for, the perfect moment to confess the feelings that had been growing within him for months. Yet the words stuck in his throat, held back by the fear that she might not be ready, that he might shatter the fragile happiness they had built together. Before he could find his voice, a knock at the door broke the moment. Tabitha stepped back, her expression a mixture of disappointment and relief as she called, "Come in." Thomas Wilson entered, his round face beaming with excitement. "Evening, you too. I've just received the most wonderful news from Boston." Tabitha quickly dried her hands on her apron. "From Father. He's received my letter." "Indeed he has," Thomas confirmed, withdrawing an envelope from his jacket pocket. "This arrived on today's mail coach." "I thought you'd want to know immediately." Tabitha took the letter eagerly, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. Ethan watched her face as she read, holding his breath until her expression brightened with joy. "He's coming," she exclaimed, looking up with shining eyes. "Father's accepted the invitation. He'll be arriving in Santa Fe on the 15th of August and hopes we can arrange transportation from there to Las Cruces." "That's wonderful news," Ethan said, genuine pleasure mixing with a touch of apprehension at the prospect of meeting Tabitha's father. "Of course we'll arrange everything. I'll go to Santa Fe myself to meet him." Tabitha's smile was radiant as she continued reading. "He says Edward called on him, full of dire warnings about my situation, but that he recognized the familiar pattern of wounded pride and exaggeration that has always characterized young Blackwell. He trusts my judgment and is eager to see the life I've built here." She looked up at Ethan, her expression softening. "He says he looks forward to meeting the man who has been so honorable in his employment of my daughter." Thomas clapped his hands in delight. "Excellent. This calls for celebration. I've brought a bottle of my best apple brandy for the occasion." As Thomas produced the bottle from his saddlebag, Ethan found himself studying Tabitha's face, memorizing the joy that illuminated her features. She caught his gaze and held it, a silent communication passing between them that needed no words. Whatever the future held, her father's visit marked a turning point in acknowledgement that her life in New Mexico was not temporary but a new beginning. That night, after Thomas had departed and the kitchen was quiet once more, Tabitha lingered by the doorway to her quarters. "Ethan," she said hesitantly, "earlier, before Uncle Thomas arrived, you were saying something." Ethan looked at her, backlit by the lamplight from her room, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, and felt a surge of tenderness so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "It can wait," he said gently. "We have time." Tabitha's smile was small but understanding. "Yes," she agreed softly, "we do." As August approached, preparations for Professor Winters's visit intensified. Ethan supervised a thorough cleaning of the entire ranch house, while Tabitha transformed the small guest bedroom into a welcoming space for her father. Complete with fresh curtains, she had sewn herself, and a bookshelf stocked with volumes she thought might interest him. "Do you think he'll be comfortable here?" she asked Ethan anxiously as they surveyed the room together. "It's so different from what he's used to in Boston." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "He'll be comfortable because you're here," he said simply. "The rest is just details." She smiled gratefully, leaning slightly into his touch. "I hope so. I want him to understand why I've chosen to stay." The words sent a thrill through Ethan, a confirmation that her decision was made, that Las Cruces and the ranch were now her home. He squeezed her shoulder gently before letting his hand fall away. "He will." As the 15th of August drew nearer, Ethan found himself increasingly nervous about meeting Professor Jonathan Winters. This was Tabitha's beloved father, the man who had raised her after her mother's death, who had shaped her character and intellect. His opinion mattered not just to Tabitha, but to Ethan as well. The day before Ethan was to depart for Santa Fe, he found himself in town, standing outside the jeweler's shop with an uncharacteristic hesitation. He had ridden in ostensibly to purchase supplies for the journey, but his feet had carried him here instead. Going in or just admiring the display? Sheriff Donovan's amused voice broke into his thoughts. Ethan turned to find the lawman watching him with knowing eyes. I was just... He trailed off, unable to articulate exactly what he was doing. Sheriff Donovan nodded toward the shop window. Mackenzie carries some fine pieces. Not many call for such things in Las Cruces, but he keeps a small selection for special occasions. The emphasis he placed on the last words made it clear he understood Ethan's dilemma perfectly. Is it that obvious? Ethan asked ruefully. The sheriff chuckled. Only to someone who's been where you are. 28 years ago, I stood right where you're standing, working up the courage to buy a ring for my Martha. His expression softened at the memory. Best decision I ever made. Ethan glanced at the simple gold bands displayed in the window. It feels presumptuous. Her father hasn't even arrived yet, and I haven't spoken to her directly about my feelings. But you know them, Sheriff Donovan said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Ethan admitted. I do. And you think she might share them? Ethan considered the question, remembering the way Tabitha looked at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't aware, the warmth in her voice when she spoke his name, the gentle touches that had become more frequent between them. I hope so. Sheriff Donovan clapped him on the shoulder. Then go in, man. Better to be prepared than caught wishing you were. With a final encouraging nod, he continued down the boardwalk, leaving Ethan alone with his decision. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed open the door to Mackenzie's shop, the small bell above jangling to announce his entrance. Inside, the jeweler looked up from his workbench, surprise registering on his weathered face. Mr. Ramsey, he greeted him, setting aside the watch he had been repairing. Don't believe I've had the pleasure of your custom before. No, Ethan agreed, suddenly feeling out of place among the glass cases of gleaming jewelry. I'm interested in. That is, I was wondering if. Understanding dawned in Mackenzie's eyes. Ah, he said simply. For Miss Winters, I presume, Ethan nodded, not bothering to ask how the jeweler knew. In a town the size of Las Cruces, everyone knew everyone else's business. Mackenzie smiled, moving to one of the display cases. I might have just the thing, simple but elegant like the lady herself. As the jeweler brought out a tray of rings, Ethan felt a mixture of terror and excitement. This was a step from which there was no turning back, a declaration of intent that would change everything. Yet as he examined the rings before him, he knew with absolute certainty that it was the right step to take. The next morning, Ethan departed for Santa Fe with a small velvet box tucked securely in his saddlebag and a promise to return within 3 days. Tabitha saw him off at dawn, her face a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Give father my love, she said, straightening his collar unnecessarily. And don't let him talk your ear off about ancient Greek philosophy. He tends to forget that not everyone shares his enthusiasm for Aristotle. Ethan smiled, capturing her fidgeting hands in his. I'll deliver your love, dodge philosophical discussions, and bring him safely to Las Cruces. I promise. Tabitha squeezed his hands gratefully. Safe journey, Ethan. As he mounted his horse and set off down the road, Ethan felt the weight of the ring in his saddlebag and the weight of possibility in his heart. The journey to Santa Fe would take most of a day, giving him ample time to consider how best to approach Professor Winters about his intentions toward Tabitha. By the time he reached the territorial capital, Ethan had rehearsed a dozen different speeches in his mind, none of which seemed adequate to express the depth of his feelings for Tabitha or his commitment to her happiness. In the end, he decided that honesty would serve him better than eloquence. The stage from the east was due to arrive the following afternoon, giving Ethan time to secure rooms at a decent hotel and rest from his journey. He spent a restless night, his mind alternating between anticipation at meeting Professor Winters and anxiety about the conversation he hoped to have with the man. When the stage finally rolled into Santa Fe, dust-covered and several hours behind schedule, Ethan was waiting in the crowded plaza. Passengers disembarked one by one, weary from the long journey but relieved to have reached their destination. Last to emerge was a tall, slender man with graying auburn hair and a thoughtful expression that immediately reminded Ethan of Tabitha, Professor Winters. Ethan approached, extending his hand. "I'm Ethan Ramsey. Tabitha sent me to escort you to Las Cruces." The professor's face brightened at the mention of his daughter. "Mr. Ramsey, a pleasure to meet you at last." He shook Ethan's hand firmly. "Tabitha's letters speak highly of you and your ranch." "The feeling is mutual," Ethan assured him. "Your daughter has become invaluable to us all." The words were inadequate to express how truly essential Tabitha had become, but they would have to do for now. Professor Winters studied him with keen eyes that seemed to see more than Ethan intended to reveal. "Indeed," he said thoughtfully. "Well, I look forward to seeing this place that has captured my daughter's heart so thoroughly." They retrieved the professor's luggage and made their way to the hotel where Ethan had reserved rooms. Over dinner, the conversation flowed easily, with Professor Winters proving to be an engaging companion despite his academic background. He was genuinely interested in the territory, asking intelligent questions about ranching, local politics, and the relations between the various cultural groups that called New Mexico home. "Tabitha writes that the community in Las Cruces has been exceptionally welcoming," he remarked as they enjoyed after-dinner coffee. "She seems happier in her letters than I've seen her in years." Ethan nodded, seizing the opening. "Las Cruces is a good place with good people. And Tabitha, she fits there, Professor, as if she was always meant to be part of the community." "Part of your household, you mean," the professor said, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Yes," Ethan admitted, "though it's more accurate to say she's made it her household as well. The ranch was just a place before she arrived. Now it's a home." Professor Winters set down his coffee cup, regarding Ethan with a frank expression. "Mr. Ramsey, I sense there's something you wish to discuss with me beyond the details of our journey to Las Cruces." This was the moment Ethan had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. He took a deep breath, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "Yes, sir, there is. I would like your blessing to ask for Tabitha's hand in marriage." The professor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't appear shocked by the request. "I see. And does my daughter share your feelings?" "I believe she does," Ethan said carefully. "Though we haven't spoken of it directly, I wanted to speak with you first out of respect for both you and her." A smile tugged at the professor's lips. Old-fashioned values. Tabitha mentioned those in her letters as well. He leaned back in his chair, considering Ethan thoughtfully. "Tell me, Mr. Ramsey, what is it you love about my daughter?" The directness of the question caught Ethan off guard, but he found the answer came easily. "Everything," he said simply. "Her kindness, her strength, the way she faces challenges without complaint, her intelligence and wit. The grace with which she's adapted to a life so different from what she knew in Boston." He paused, then added quietly, "The way she makes everyone around her better by her presence." Professor Winters nodded slowly. "And what would you offer her as a husband that she doesn't already have as your employee, security?" Ethan replied without hesitation. "Partnership. A future built together rather than separately. Children if she wants them. My name, my heart, everything I have or ever will have." He met the professor's gaze steadily. "And love, complete and unwavering for as long as I live." A long moment of silence followed his words. Then, to Ethan's surprise, Professor Winters smiled broadly. "Well said, Mr. Ramsey, very well said indeed." He extended his hand across the table. "You have my blessing, though I suspect you would have proceeded regardless." Ethan shook the offered hand, relief washing over him. "Thank you, sir. But no, I wouldn't have proceeded without your blessing. Tabitha loves you deeply. Your approval matters to her and therefore to me." The professor's expression softened. She's fortunate to have found a man who understands such things. He raised his coffee cup in a small toast. "To your future happiness, both of you." The journey to Las Cruces the following day was more relaxed, with the major hurdle of securing Professor Winters's blessing now behind them. They traveled in a rented buggy, more comfortable than horseback for the professor, taking their time and stopping occasionally for Ethan to point out interesting features of the landscape. "It's remarkable country," Professor Winters observed as they paused to rest the horses near a striking rock formation. "Harsh in its way, but with a beauty I hadn't anticipated from Tabitha's descriptions." "It grows on you," Ethan agreed. "I was born in Missouri, came west with my parents when I was 10. Couldn't imagine living anywhere else now." "And you think Tabitha feels the same, that she won't miss Boston and its amenities?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "I think she misses certain aspects of Boston, the libraries, the museums, the changing seasons. But I don't think she misses the social constraints or the expectations placed on her there." He gestured at the open landscape around them. "Here, she's free to be herself." "I believe that matters more to her than concerts or fancy shops." Professor Winters nodded thoughtfully. "You understand her well for a man who's known her less than a year." "Sometimes it doesn't take long to recognize what's true," Ethan said simply. The professor smiled at that. "Indeed not. I knew my wife was the one for me within a week of our first meeting. My colleagues thought I was rushing foolishly, but I never doubted." His expression turned wistful. 17 years together wasn't nearly enough, but they were the best years of my life." "Tabitha has her mother's strength," Ethan observed, "and your intellect. And a heart entirely her own," the professor added. "Kind but not soft, forgiving but not foolish." "Exactly," Ethan agreed, pleased that Tabitha's father saw her as clearly as he did. They continued their journey, the conversation flowing easily between them. By the time Las Cruces came into view on the horizon, Ethan felt he had gained not just the professor's blessing, but perhaps the beginnings of a friendship as well. As they approached the ranch, Ethan spotted Tabitha waiting on the porch, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun. The moment she recognized the buggy, she hurried down the steps, her face alight with joy. "They're here." She called over her shoulder, presumably to Miguel or Josiah inside the house. Then she was running toward them, her skirts gathered in one hand, propriety forgotten in her excitement. Professor Winters was out of the buggy almost before it stopped, opening his arms to receive his daughter's embrace. "My dear girl," he murmured, holding her tightly. "How I've missed you." Ethan remained in the driver's seat, giving father and daughter a moment of privacy for their reunion. He watched as they held each other, talking rapidly, the professor's hands framing Tabitha's face as if to reassure himself that she was well and happy. Finally, Tabitha turned toward the buggy, her eyes finding Ethan's with a warmth that made his heart skip. "Thank you for bringing him safely," she said, moving to stand beside the vehicle. "As promised," Ethan replied, climbing down to join them. "Though I can't take credit for the good weather or easy journey." Tabitha smiled up at him, then turned to her father. "Come inside, Papa. I want to show you everything." As they walked toward the house, Tabitha between them, Ethan exchanged a brief glance with Professor Winters over her head. The older man's slight nod conveyed his approval and encouragement, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. The small velvet box still rested in Ethan's pocket, its weight a promise of the question he would soon ask. But for now, he was content to watch Tabitha's happiness as she proudly showed her father the home she had helped create in the heart of the New Mexico territory. Professor Winters's visit transformed the rhythm of life at the ranch. Meals became longer, more conversational affairs as the professor regaled them with tales of Boston academic life and his own scholarly pursuits. He proved to be an engaging storyteller, his dry wit drawing laughter from everyone at the table, including the usually taciturn Josiah. Ethan watched with pleasure as Tabitha blossomed under her father's approving gaze. Any lingering doubts she might have harbored about her decision to remain in Las Cruces seemed to vanish as Professor Winters repeatedly expressed his admiration for the life she had built. "You've accomplished more in a few months here than some of my colleagues have in decades of academic posturing," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, the sunset painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "You've created something real, something meaningful." Tabitha's pleased smile warmed Ethan's heart. "It hasn't always been easy," she admitted, "but it's been worthwhile. I feel purposeful here." The professor nodded, his gaze shifting briefly to Ethan. "And welcomed, I think, valued for your contributions rather than your social connections." "Very much so," Tabitha agreed, her own glance toward Ethan carrying a depth of feeling that made his breath catch. The days passed quickly, filled with tours of the ranch, visits to town where Professor Winters was warmly received by the locals, and long evenings of conversation. Ethan found himself increasingly drawn to the professor's intellect and humor, seeing in him the roots of many of Tabitha's finest qualities. For his part, Professor Winters made no secret of his approval of Ethan and the ranch. "I came prepared to be skeptical," he confessed during a private moment when Tabitha was occupied elsewhere. "A father's prerogative, you understand, but I can see now why Tabitha chose to stay. This is a good place, Mr. Ramsay, and you are a good man." Ethan accepted the compliment with a nod of gratitude. "I try to be, especially for her." As the professor's visit neared its end, Ethan knew he could delay no longer. The velvet box had burned a hole in his pocket for days, waiting for the perfect moment to present itself. That moment came on a clear evening when Miguel and Josiah had gone into town for supplies, and Professor Winters announced his intention to retire early with a book. "You young people enjoy the evening," he said with a suspiciously convenient yawn. "I find I'm more tired than usual tonight." Left alone on the porch, Tabitha and Ethan sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The air was warm but not oppressive, scented with the sage and juniper that grew wild around the ranch. "Father leaves the day after tomorrow," Tabitha said finally, a hint of sadness in her voice. "I'll miss him terribly." "He can visit again," Ethan assured her, "and perhaps someday you might visit Boston." Tabitha nodded, considering this. "Perhaps. Though it would be strange to return as a visitor to the place that was once my home." "Is Las Cruces home now?" Ethan asked, his heart in his throat as he waited for her answer. She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflective in the fading light. "Yes," she said simply. "It is." Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "Tabitha, there's something I've been wanting to ask you, something I've been thinking about since that morning you walked into my kitchen and told me to move over so you could stir the pot." A small smile curved her lips at the memory. "You were making quite a mess of those eggs." "I was making a mess of a lot of things," Ethan admitted. "Not just the cooking. The ranch was running well enough, but it wasn't a home, not until you came." He shifted in his chair to face her more directly. "You changed everything, Tabitha. Not just the meals, but the whole feeling of the place, of my life." Her expression softened, a hint of vulnerability entering her eyes. "Ethan, please let me finish before I lose my nerve," he said quickly. "I've faced down cattle rustlers and flash floods and once even a mountain lion, but I've never been as nervous as I am right now." Tabitha fell silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for him to continue. Ethan reached into his pocket, withdrawing the small velvet box. I spoke with your father in Santa Fe, asked for his blessing. He gave it, though he said the decision was entirely yours. He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band set with a single, perfect diamond. Tabitha Winters, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Tabitha stared at the ring, her expression unreadable. Then, to Ethan's alarm, tears welled in her eyes and began to spill down her cheeks. "Tabitha," he asked anxiously. "I'm sorry if I've spoken too soon or if you don't—" "Yes," she interrupted, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Ethan, I will marry you." Relief and joy surged through him in equal measure. "You will?" Tabitha laughed through her tears, reaching out to touch his face with gentle fingers. "Of course I will. I've been waiting for you to ask since. Well, perhaps since that night you stayed by my bedside during my fever, or maybe even before that." Ethan took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger with slightly trembling hands. "I've loved you for so long, it's hard to remember a time when I didn't." "Show me," Tabitha whispered, her eyes luminous in the gathering darkness. Ethan didn't need to be asked twice. He leaned forward, cupping her face gently in his hands, and kissed her with all the tenderness and passion he had held in check for months. Tabitha responded eagerly, her arms twining around his neck, drawing him closer as the kiss deepened. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Tabitha Winters, more than I have words to express." "I love you too, Ethan Ramsey," she replied, her voice sure and clear. "Enough to spend my life with you in this wild, beautiful country." They remained on the porch for hours, talking, planning, dreaming of their future together. When they finally entered the house, hand in hand, they found Professor Winters in the kitchen, a knowing smile on his face as he pretended to be searching for a late-night snack. "I see congratulations are in order," he said, nodding toward their linked hands and the ring glinting on Tabitha's finger. Tabitha rushed to embrace her father. "You knew, all along, since Santa Fe," he confirmed, hugging her tightly before extending his hand to Ethan. "Welcome to the family, son. Take good care of my girl." "With everything I have, sir," Ethan promised, shaking the professor's hand firmly. "For as long as I live." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple but joyful ceremony in the Las Cruces church. Professor Winters had extended his visit to give away the bride, and the entire town turned out to celebrate the union of two people who had become cherished members of the community. Tabitha wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had been her mother's, lovingly altered by the ladies of Las Cruces to suit her more slender frame. Ethan, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, could scarcely believe his good fortune as he watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm, her face radiant with happiness. The celebration afterward was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard under strings of lanterns. There was music and dancing, abundant food and drink, and more laughter than the old ranch house had heard in all its years. As evening fell and the festivities continued around them, Ethan led his new wife away from the crowd for a moment of privacy behind the barn. "Happy, Mrs. Ramsey?" he asked, still marveling at the right to call her by his name. "Completely," Tabitha assured him, her arms looped around his neck. "Though I do have one confession to make." Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh," she smiled mischievously. "That first morning when I told you to move over so I could stir the pot, I wasn't entirely sure I could do any better. I was bluffing a bit." Ethan laughed, pulling her closer. "Well, it was a successful bluff. You saved us all from starvation. And found something I wasn't even looking for in the process," Tabitha added softly. "A home, a purpose, a love I never expected." "I'd say that's worth a bit of bluffing," Ethan murmured, lowering his head to kiss her again. From the yard came the sound of laughter and music, the community that had embraced them both celebrating their union. Soon, They would return to their guests, to the dancing and toasting that would continue well into the night. But for now, in this quiet moment, it was just the two of them, a rancher who had once burned every meal for a month, and the woman who had walked in one morning and said, "Move over, I'll stir the pot," changing both their lives forever. 5 years later, the Ramsey Ranch had nearly doubled in size and prosperity. Careful management and strategic land purchases had expanded their holdings, and the herd was now one of the finest in the territory. The ranch house had grown as well, with additional rooms built to accommodate their growing family. On a warm spring morning, Ethan stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching as his 3-year-old son, Jonathan, named for Tabitha's father, chased butterflies in the yard under the watchful eye of Maria, the Mexican woman who helped with the household now that Tabitha's duties had expanded beyond cooking. From inside came the sound of Tabitha's voice, singing softly to their newest addition, 1-month-old Alina, named for Ethan's mother. The gentle lullaby drifted through the open window, filling Ethan's heart with a contentment so profound it sometimes still took him by surprise. "Papa, look," Jonathan called, pointing excitedly at a particularly large butterfly that had landed on a nearby flowering bush. "I see it, son," Ethan called back, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. Jonathan had Tabitha's auburn hair and keen intelligence, combined with Ethan's height and sturdy build, a perfect blend of them both. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the road, where a rider approached at a leisurely pace. As the figure drew nearer, Ethan recognized Thomas Wilson, still robust despite the passing years, his round face creased in a perpetual smile these days. "Morning, Thomas," Ethan called, setting down his coffee cup to greet his visitor. "What brings you out this way so early?" Thomas dismounted with the agility of a much younger man, tipping his hat to Maria and swooping Jonathan up for a hug before answering. "Letter from Boston," he explained, reaching into his jacket pocket. "Thought you and Tabitha would want it right away, from her father." Professor Winters had returned to Boston after the wedding, but had visited twice since then, once when Jonathan was born, and again last year for an extended summer stay. His letters were frequent and always eagerly anticipated, filled with news of his academic life and warm inquiries about the family. "Tabitha will be delighted," Ethan said, accepting the letter. "She was just saying yesterday that we were overdue for news from Boston." "Come inside, she'll want to read it with you here." They entered the house, where they found Tabitha in the parlor, gently rocking Alina in her arms. The years had added a subtle maturity to her beauty. Motherhood suited her, bringing a new softness to her features while strengthening the quiet confidence that had always characterized her. "Uncle Thomas," she exclaimed, her face lighting up. "What a lovely surprise." Thomas beamed at the sight of his niece and the infant. "Brought a letter from your father," he explained, gesturing to the envelope in Ethan's hand. "And wanted to see this little beauty again, of course." Tabitha smiled, carefully shifting Alina so that Thomas could see her better. "She's just fallen asleep, but you're welcome to hold her if you like." While Thomas cooed over the baby, Ethan handed the letter to Tabitha. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" he offered, knowing she would be reluctant to disturb Alina's peaceful slumber. Tabitha nodded gratefully. "Please." Ethan broke the seal and unfolded the thick pages covered in Professor Winters's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest Tabitha, Ethan, and precious grandchildren," he began, "I write with exciting news. After much consideration, I have decided to accept the position offered by the newly established University of New Mexico in Santa Fe. Beginning this fall, I will be professor of classical studies and philosophy, a role that will allow me to continue my academic work while being considerably closer to my beloved family." Tabitha gasped, her eyes widening with delight. "Papa's moving to Santa Fe." but his life is in Boston, his colleagues, his research. Ethan continued reading. You may wonder at this decision, given my long association with Harvard. The truth is, my dear ones, that while academic pursuits still engage my mind, it is family that now claims my heart. The weeks I spend with you each year are no longer sufficient. I wish to see my grandchildren grow, to be a regular presence in their lives rather than a distant figure known primarily through letters. Santa Fe is but a day's journey from Las Cruces, near enough for frequent visits, yet far enough to avoid being an imposition. As if he could ever be an imposition, Tabitha murmured, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. The university is small but growing, Ethan read on, with ambitions to become a center of learning for the territory. They have offered me considerable freedom in developing my courses, and the opportunity to help shape a new educational institution is one I find I cannot refuse at this stage of my career. I have already secured a small house near the campus, with a garden that I hope will entice Jonathan to visit his grandfather often. I expect to arrive by late August, in time to settle before the academic year begins. Thomas clapped his hands in delight, careful not to disturb the sleeping Alina. What wonderful news! Jonathan in Santa Fe, we must celebrate. Tabitha nodded, still processing the joyful surprise. It's incredible to have Papa so close. She looked at Ethan, her eyes shining. Our children will grow up knowing their grandfather, and he'll be near enough to share in all the important moments. I can only express my gratitude, Ethan continued reading, to both of you for showing me that life in the territory is rich and rewarding in ways I never anticipated. Tabitha, my dear, your courage in forging a new path has inspired me to do the same, albeit somewhat later in life. And Ethan, your steadfast character and the loving home you have created with my daughter have given me the confidence that even at my age, new beginnings are possible. Give my love to little Jonathan and a kiss to baby Alina. I count the days until I can hold them both in my arms again. With all my affection, your devoted father and grandfather, Jonathan Winters. When Ethan finished reading, the room was quiet save for Alina's soft breathing and Jonathan's excited chatter from the kitchen, where Maria had taken him for a snack. Tabitha's eyes were full of tears, though her smile was radiant. I never imagined. She began, then paused to compose herself. When I left Boston, I thought I was leaving everything behind. My home, my family, my entire world. And now look, Father, coming to New Mexico, our beautiful children, this ranch, this life we've built together. She reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it tightly. It's more than I ever dreamed possible. Ethan raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. You make dreams possible, Tabitha. You always have. Thomas watched them with misty eyes, cradling Alina carefully in his arms. I knew the moment I brought you to this ranch that something special would come of it, he said proudly. Call it an uncle's intuition. They laughed together, the joy of the moment filling the sunlit room. Outside, the ranch stretched toward the distant mountains. The land that had once seemed so foreign to Tabitha now as familiar and beloved as the faces of her children. Inside, the house that had once echoed with Ethan's solitude now rang with family voices, with laughter and occasional tears, with the thousand small sounds that make a house a home. Later that evening, after Thomas had departed and the children were asleep, Ethan and Tabitha sat on the porch swing, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the stars appear one by one in the vast New Mexico sky. Do you ever wonder, Tabitha asked softly, what would have happened if Uncle Thomas hadn't brought me to the ranch that day? If you hadn't been quite so hopeless at cooking, Ethan smiled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. I try not to think about it. The idea of my life without you in it, it doesn't bear considering. Tabitha nodded, understanding perfectly. I feel the same way. It's as if everything before was just preparation, leading me here to you, to this life we've made together. A life that started with burnt eggs and a woman brave enough to take over my kitchen, Ethan mused, pressing a kiss to her temple. Tabitha laughed softly, the sound as precious to him now as it had been the first time he heard it. Who would have thought that move over I'll stir the pot would lead to all this? I'm glad it did, Ethan said simply. Every day I'm glad it did. As the night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, talking softly of Professor Winters's imminent arrival in Santa Fe, of Jonathan's growing curiosity about the world, of Alina's first smile that morning. Small moments, ordinary conversations, the stuff of a life built together, day by day, choice by choice, love by love. Inside the house, the kitchen where it all began stood clean and ready for morning. The hearth that had once produced only smoke and charred food, now the heart of a home filled with warmth and nourishment. And outside, under the vast canopy of stars, a rancher and the woman who had saved him from his own cooking held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that would keep them that way for all the days to come.